Britain for a specific period, and if you could think of it like a scale, okay, so things are more or less along the lines of a scale. In other words, there would have been periods in history where there would have been a freer economy, a freer market. Okay, for example, you would argue that after 1815, when government wars had ended in France, there would have arguably have been a freer period. Another thing, in Britain, for example, the people had protested and fought hard for free trade. Now, free trade came about in 1843, and it lasted until 1913. Again, you could look at that time period and say that was freer, okay, because of the free trade. That's something that's very important. So, you would say that the more capitalist the economies become, the more success you would have seen. Whereas the less capitalist, the worse off. And there's no better example of that than the period between 1756 to 1815. Why do I mention that? Because if you were to look at that period in history, this was largely a period where Britain, well, let's just say the British government, had took Britain to countless wars for, a good 70 odd years. For all these wars, such as the Spanish Wars, the wars, of course, in America, they fought for their independence, the wars in France, etc. And the reason why it's important to look at that is because you would then see that it was affecting the people. Even the government levying taxation, such as the things like the Corn Law, etc. And also, of course, they did have the window taxes. Looking at, of course, the statistical evidence of real wage earnings and other things such as the wealth, we need to look at the Industrial Revolution, not from what life was like after the Industrial Revolution, but to look at what life was like before then. And this is basically what I want to touch upon in this video, and then I'll go on and several other parts, because it's important to understand that you do not judge progress by looking at what you have today and then comparing it to back in that time period. It's a big mistake to make, and it's that, believe it or not, and this is the truth. You can even do your own independent research on this. Most of your common historians today believe or have written, and these are people who came out of university with degrees. I mean, I even had a debate with one, and he came out the other end, top of his year or something in university, and he studied history, and he came out stating that living standards had collapsed in the first Industrial Revolution. And you wouldn't, as soon as you find out the statistical evidence of what wealth was like before the Industrial Revolution and then compare that to 1850, you'll then see what's wrong with that, even with regards to living standards. I mean, we've got even words from a socialist historian who concedes that living standards had improved. But that's the point. It's this misconception that people have of that period. So, in order to judge progress, you don't look at the 1840s and say, well, the conditions were absolutely awful and deplorable, and you know, how could you support capitalism when the conditions were terrible and smelly and dark, and it's just so awful. I mean, how could you support such a thing? And you can understand people's view on that, but they don't see it from the perspective of what life was like before then. They don't understand that, and that's why I want to do, you know, the videos explaining about the Industrial Revolution, because in their view, you know, that's how things were. It was this, if you look at things from a picture, because this is what most of your common day historians today, and as I was saying, this university degree student or whatever basically studied the Industrial Revolution, is claiming that the living standards had collapsed, and therefore this is their argument for why we needed government to step in and save us all. In other words, in their view, government was our saviour, and nothing could be further from the truth. And there is so much evidence out there, not even just from statistics, but there's so much evidence out there on the alternative that proves that completely wrong. And that's why I want to address that, because you can't just look at what you have today, such as, for example, the wages that you get paid today, and then say, well, let's compare that to what people were getting paid in the 1840s, and then say this is the reason why we should avoid capitalism at all costs. I mean, it's a ridiculous argument, and the reason why it's ridiculous is because you can't say whether there was progress from that. There's no possible way that you can say there was progress from. I mean, it's so silly, because we are where we are today because of the Industrial Revolution. We would not be where we are today if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. That is just a simple fact, and it's quite ludicrous that people actually believe the nonsense they're being fed about that time period, where they actually believe that their living standards had collapsed. Yet in the 1840s, people actually had food on their tables to eat. I don't think they understand what that means. It's almost like, if you could picture it this way, it's almost like as if they view that period of history. You could kind of picture the Shire of Lord of the Rings, and they're all, you know, singing, dancing and playing, and they're all happy, and then someone sticks a ring on, and then a big cloud of darkness comes over the top of them. That is kind of how they view that history of the 18th century, referring to the 1700s. They think that life was, you know, life was all rosy before the Industrial Revolution, and they think that these factories came into being, and then all of a sudden, you know, a big cloud of darkness came over the top of them, and it's just this, the way they've made this picture of capitalism as this evil thing where factory owners, as I say, they claimed that they forced them into working in them, and it was all slavery, and they get paid dirt poor wages, as if to say that the people were getting paid more before the factories, which again could not be further from the truth. Again, we'll touch upon that, but what I'm saying is, this is how they view that period. So in order to judge true progress, what we need to do is we need to look at what life would have been like throughout the 17th century, and much of the 18th, you know, for hundreds of years before. You're talking about, like, even back in the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, much of the 1700s. You have to look at that time period, look at the wealth then, and then you get a true picture as to whether there was progress in the Industrial Revolution or not. So in other words, you're then able to make a picture of how life would have been like in the 1840s. I mean, to us, okay, I mean, sure, we could sit there and historians had actually compared it by looking at still pictures. And the problem with still pictures is the very fact that you can't tell whether there's been progress or not. It is also important to have the mentality that, you know, just because something did not exist to them, it doesn't make them, let's just say, poorer, in a sense that the best example that I could use is my own circumstance. I was born in 1984, and when I was just a wee kid, I had things like the Mega Drive and things like that, and mobile phones didn't exist. Well, not to my recollection. Nobody went around with mobile phones. You had your house phone and that was it, and you never had the internet, you know. And even if there was computers, it was like your Amstrads and perhaps your really, really old computers. They never really had the well, not the type of operating systems that you do today. There's just so much we didn't have. But if you could think of it from this perspective, that even the internet, you could not picture life today without it. You couldn't. Everybody's using it. Even when you're out the house, people are using the internet on smartphones, on a phone. Think about that for a second. On a phone, you're taking that for granted. Think about that. You've got things like the internet, where you're able to communicate with someone over the other end of the world, simply from being outside and being able to use whatever it is on a mobile phone. Even listen to music on a phone. All of these wee things. So, if you could picture it like this, when we, the normal people, we understand that the internet existed back with the military and all the rest of it. They had, I think, years and years ago. We didn't get it until about 1997 or something. Most people didn't even know it existed. We didn't even know what the internet was. But this is the point. Before the internet existed, you could not feel deprived about something you didn't know existed. You simply took for what you had, and that was it. It's a bit like us living today, where there's things that right now we don't even know anything about. We cannot feel deprived about what we don't know exists, because it hasn't been created yet. And a good example of this would be a games console. I used to be, you know, emphatic about things like the graphics. I've always been fascinated with graphics, especially with things like Sonic the Hedgehog and things like that. I used to sit and play all that, and I was always someone who picked up on the wee things, the graphics and the sound and things. And I remember Mega CD, when they brought out Echo the Dolphin, and one of the things that just blew me away was the sound of the dolphin coming out of the water, and it really amazed me, because at that time that was just something new. It was like something spectacular. Now it's just it's like, who cares? But it's that thing where when you go from having those type of graphics, even 32x and things, and it was like, oh wow, this really blows me away, it's not until a newer console comes out that you didn't know exists, and when that comes out and it just completely blows what you've been playing out of the water, you sit back and you think, wow, that's just I'm lost for words. You know what I mean? It's just I can't believe I was playing that shit all those years. Don't get me wrong, some of the old classic games are still good, and I kind of get the point in that. But that's the point. I mean, it's one of these things that things progress so much, and we take things for granted. So the point being is that mentality, the mentality that even for those people who lived in the 1840s, they could not feel deprived about what did not exist until later periods. I think it sounds crazy saying this, but toilet paper didn't come about until about the 1880s or something. So in other words, life before all of that, they didn't really think about that. If they did, it would have existed before then. You understand? Toilet paper would have existed years and years ago. Before then, it never. And they couldn't feel deprived about that. They couldn't say, "Oh, I don't have toilet paper." How could they? If they were to think that, toilet paper would have existed long before the 1880s. I mean, we too take things for granted, but the point being, they couldn't feel deprived about things that we have today because it didn't exist to them. Just like how the internet to us before the, late 1990s, we couldn't feel deprived about that because it didn't exist. So it's important to really look at things from that perspective, because then you get a view of just how things would have been with regards to the people who were living in that time period. And I will of course touch upon things like the children and other parts, much of what I had learned myself from the likes of, thanks to the likes of libertarianism.org and of course the Mises Institute. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.